His name equaled fear. Preacher equaled death.
There probably was close to 45 homicides that related to Preacher and members of his organizations.
What they would do is he would vote thumbs up or thumbs down like the Roman gladiator days, and he was the ruler. He would just go like this with the thumb, and that meant kill him.
This is what investigators discovered about the man who terrorized New York's most dangerous criminals. 45 murders. A twisted ruler who decided life and death with the flick of his thumb. But his victims weren't just random street dealers. Alpo Martinez, one of the most feared killers in Harlem's history, operated under this man's shadow, paying tribute just to stay alive in his own neighborhood.
Preacher crew was the established crew in the neighborhood, for a long time. Preacher had been kicking around the streets of Harlem since the early 70s, and everybody knew him by his nickname, the Black Hand of Death, and everybody was definitely afraid of him.
The Supreme Team's top enforcer, Gerald Prince Miller, thought his organizational power could challenge this monster. He was wrong.
You approaching Preacher about 6'6", 6'8". Probably like what, 290, 300 pounds, solid. To me, you're smart. But then again, here it is, you can't think that you alone can approach somebody like Preacher.
And when his reach extended beyond the streets into celebrity culture, even Whitney Houston, at the peak of her global fame, had to bow down.
She had just made the movie The Bodyguard. And she came to the Bronx by herself in a cab with a big pair of glasses and a wig with $400,000 in the bag to come get that.
From legendary drug dealers to international superstars, one man had them all terrified. Everyone who lived in his world knew the same truth.
You could walk up to anybody in the 32nd precinct. No matter how church-going they are, no matter whether they're businessmen or local drug dealers, they all have a Preacher story. They all know who Preacher is.
This is how Clarence Preacher Heatley single-handedly terrorized them all. Look, everybody knows about Alpo Martinez. Dude was moving serious weight from Harlem to DC, making millions, and wasn't afraid to body his own people when it came to business. Then you had the Supreme Team out in Queens. These cats were organized like the mob, controlling whole territories with their enforcer Gerald Prince Miller, who everybody feared. These were the type of dudes who had whole neighborhoods on lock, real kingpins who seemed untouchable. But here's what's crazy. All these legends, all these so-called kings of the street, they all had to bow down to one man. One dude who could roll up on any of them and demand whatever he wanted. That man was Clarence Preacher Heatley. And when people in Harlem heard his name, they knew death was coming.
His name equaled fear. Preacher equaled death.
This wasn't just another drug dealer trying to get rich. Preacher was something different, a straight-up monster who figured out he didn't need to sell drugs when he could just tax everybody who did. Think about that for a second. While Alpo and Rich Porter were risking their lives moving kilos, Preacher was sitting back collecting tribute from all of them like some kind of street emperor. Standing 6'7" and weighing damn near 300 pounds, Preacher looked like he could break you in half just by looking at you wrong. But it wasn't just his size that made him dangerous. This dude was a master manipulator who could talk his way into your head and make you do whatever he wanted. That's how he got his nickname. When Preacher talked, people listened, not because they wanted to, but because they were scared of what would happen if they didn't. Born in Harlem in the early 50s, Preacher's criminal education started when he was just 9 years old in juvenile detention. By 10, he dropped out of school, never made it past 4th grade. But what he lacked in book smarts, he made up for in street intelligence and pure evil. This man spent most of his young life going in and out of prison, learning how to break people's minds and bend them to his will. When he hit the streets in the early 80s, he wasn't trying to build no traditional drug empire. Preacher had a different plan. He was gonna make everybody else work for him whether they liked it or not. His crew operated like a cult with him as the leader. Members called him Dad, and his word was literally life or death. They had these dudes called janitors who cleaned up after murders, and to become one, you had to kill somebody first. These cats even tattooed mops with blood dripping from them on their shoulders like some sick badge of honor.
The police know they just cannot make a case. There's nobody in Harlem, nobody in the South Bronx who's willing to talk, because if you go and say it's a snitch, tell us something about the preacher crew, you're gonna be dead.
The basement of 2075 Grand Concourse in the Bronx became his house of horrors. This is where Preacher would hold these twisted trials, making his crew vote on whether someone lived or died with a thumbs up or thumbs down. If you got the thumbs down, you were about to be tortured, murdered, and chopped up while everybody else watched. This wasn't just business. This was psychological warfare designed to keep everybody in line through pure terror. Now let me tell you how Preacher had these so-called street legends shook. Rich Porter was that dude in Harlem, young, flashy, moving serious weight and making millions before he was even 25. This cat had the cars, the jewelry, the whole nine, and everybody respected his gangster. Alpo Martinez was his partner, another killer who wasn't afraid of nobody and would murk his own people if the money was right. But when Preacher decided he wanted a piece of their action, all that tough guy show went out the window real quick. Big Ross was tight with Rich Porter back then, and he tells the story of what happened when Preacher pulled up on him when he was just an 18-year-old trying to get his hustle on.
I seen the black Benz, the black jet black Benz with the name Preacher abbreviated on the back. They approached me before. You tell your boss, leave some money down, in the garbage can down the block.
Picture this. You're 18 years old trying to make some money on the block, and this jet black Mercedes with Preacher on the back pulls up like the Grim Reaper. Out steps this giant who looks like he could snap you in half, and he's not asking for money. He's telling you to put $15,000 in a garbage can down the street. For a young dude just starting out, that's months of profit. But Big Ross knew he didn't have a choice. When he called Rich Porter about the situation, hoping maybe his connect could help him out, Rich's response said everything about how these streets really worked.
So when you beat Rich and he responded back to you, and you told him the situation, what he said?
Shut it down.
Shut the whole spot down?
He said shut it down for right now. I'll be back later on.
Think about that for a minute. Rich Porter wasn't no punk. This dude had built his reputation on violence and had been in shootouts with rivals who tried to test him. But when it came to Preacher, there was no "let's handle this" or "call the crew." It was straight up, shut everything down right now, because Rich understood the hierarchy. Preacher wasn't someone you fought, he was someone you paid. This is how Preacher revolutionized the extortion game. Traditional protection rackets took time, relationships, negotiations. Preacher's system was simple. He'd pull up, make his demand, and collect from dealers who knew that saying no meant death. And not just death. We're talking about the kind of torture that would make you beg to die.
Preacher looked at me and Preacher said, "Yo, what's up? You owe me some money." I said, "Yo, what I owe you for?" He said, "Yo, you know when the police came, they ran up in my spot instead of your spot. Y'all was out there making all that noise, blah, 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 blah." And this is a true story. I'm standing there.
Roger Bonds had his own run-in with Preacher that shows how this dude's mind worked. When the police raided Preacher's spot by mistake because of noise from Bonds' operation, Preacher held him responsible and demanded payment for the inconvenience. The wild part? This confrontation happened right in front of Rich Porter and Alpo Martinez, two of the most feared dudes in Harlem, and they just stood there and watched. That tells you everything you need to know about the real power structure. Even Alpo, who would eventually kill Rich Porter over money, never tried to challenge Preacher directly. These dudes understood that while they might be willing to kill their friends for profit, Preacher was the apex criminal who everybody else paid tribute to stay alive.
But he was mostly into extortion, extorting drug dealers. These are guys that were violent in their own right. He would go up and claim their car. If a drug dealer looked like he was getting paid, so to say, he was driving a brand new full-size Mercedes-Benz, and Preacher liked that car, that was Preacher's.
What you need to know is that the Supreme Team was different from your average street crew. These cats out in Queens had their operations put together. They were organized like a real business, controlled territories through strategy and violence, and had built one of the most sophisticated drug operations in New York. Gerald Prince Miller was their main enforcer, the dude other criminals called when they needed problems solved permanently. Prince had built his whole identity around being the toughest, most feared enforcer in the game. His supreme team backing gave him the power to walk into any situation and make people comply through intimidation alone. This wasn't just some corner boy with a gun. Prince was a professional problem solver whose reputation could end conflicts before they started. But all that street credibility meant absolutely nothing when Prince found himself locked up in the same federal facility as Preacher. Brian Glaze Gibbs was there and witnessed what happened when Supreme Team authority met real monster power.
You approaching Preacher about 6'6", 6'8". Probably like what, 290, 300 pounds solid? You know, to me, you're smart. But then again, here it is, you can't think that you alone can approach somebody like Preacher.
Picture the scene. Prince rolls up on Preacher with his crew, trying to run the same intimidation game that had worked for him on the streets. He's demanding to see paperwork, trying to force Preacher to check in like he's some kind of snitch. This was Prince's standard move. Use his Supreme Team reputation and crew backing to establish dominance over other inmates. But Preacher wasn't impressed by none of that organizational stuff. Here's Prince, maybe 5'10" and 200 pounds, trying to punk a 6'7", 300-pound giant who had been terrorizing New York since before Prince was even in the game. The size difference was obvious, but the real problem was that Prince was operating completely outside his element.
That didn't go too well. Because once again, Preacher's not your average individual. Preacher, regardless of what, yeah, they say he made a deal, but he lied and they ripped up the agreement. But you thought that you was powerful enough, or you had enough manpower, you know what I'm saying, to go against somebody like Preacher. Guess what? You're probably smarter than him, but you don't got the to take him out.
When Prince's intimidation tactics failed completely, word spread through the prison like wildfire. The legendary Supreme Team enforcer had just been punked by one man who didn't need a crew, didn't need territory, didn't need nothing but his own reputation for violence. This wasn't just a personal loss for Prince. It was a symbolic crushing of everything the Supreme Team represented. And Prince didn't learn his lesson. According to Gibbs, he kept trying to run his mouth and flex on people who weren't having it, including some Brooklyn cats who damn near killed him for his troubles.
What happened with Solomon? They tore you up. Almost.
This is what happens when your whole identity is built on organizational power instead of personal capacity for violence. Prince had been the Supreme Team's enforcer, but he was enforcing on behalf of a structure. Preacher was different. He was a savage, ruthless instinct who had never needed anybody else to back up his threats. When you stripped away the crew support and territorial advantages, Prince was just another inmate trying to punch above his weight class. The fact that the Supreme Team's top enforcer got handled like that by one man sent shockwaves through the entire criminal underworld. It proved that no matter how organized you were, no matter how much territory you controlled, no matter how feared your crew was, there was still one man who could reduce all of that to nothing just by showing up. Now, this next story is going to mess you up because it shows just how deep Preacher's evil could go. We're talking about the abduction and murder of Donald Porter, Rich Porter's little brother. But here's the part that'll really make you sick. This wasn't done by some rival crew or unknown enemies. This crime was set up by Rich's own uncle, a grimy dude named Johnny Apple Porter who was willing to destroy his own family for money. Apple had been watching Rich's success with pure jealousy and resentment. While his nephew was getting rich, driving luxury cars, and commanding respect throughout Harlem, Apple was stuck doing small-time hustles and depending on handouts. So this snake came up with a plan that would make him rich quick, abduct his own nephew's little brother, and demand ransom money.
But to my knowledge, from what I hear, the uncle set that situation up. Preacher didn't have a clue of that, but when he learned about it, you feel me, he was kind of upset. This is what I hear with them, but you know, they had to play it out because it was It was already involved.
According to Ozzy Faison, who knew all the players in this situation, Preacher was actually disgusted when he found out Apple was willing to target his own blood. Even a monster like Preacher had some boundaries when it came to family betrayal. But once the plan was in motion, his organization was going to see it through to the end, regardless of his personal feelings about Apple's character. On December 5th, 1989, 12-year-old Donald Porter left his apartment and started walking to school like he did every morning. He never made it to class. The boy was snatched just 4 blocks from home by Preacher's crew and disappeared into a nightmare that would traumatize his family forever. The abductors initially demanded $500,000 from Rich, then lowered it to $350,000 when the family said they couldn't get that much cash together quickly. But when the family still couldn't pay fast enough, these animals decided to escalate their tactics to prove they were serious about collecting their money.
It wasn't just a conversation with him speaking to his little brother. They had already cut his little brother's finger off.
That's the voice of a 12-year-old boy begging for his life after these monsters cut off his finger and recorded him crying in pain. They put that recording in a coffee can along with his severed finger and left it in a McDonald's bathroom for his family to find. This wasn't just extortion. This was psychological terrorism designed to break his family's spirit and force them to pay whatever these demons demanded. But then, the situation got even worse. On January 4th, 1990, exactly 1 month after Donald was abducted, Rich Porter was murdered by his own partner, Alpo Martinez, over some drug money dispute. Big Ross, who was close to Rich during this crisis, described how different Rich and Alpo's approaches were to the abduction.
Poe basically wanted to kill him. I mean, Rich did too, but, you know, Poe was more focused on...
And when you say kill him, you talking about the people that Darnell.
Darnell,
okay.
Yeah, he was more like, his whole thing was more like, yo, he was focused more on the murder game, like right now.
While Rich was desperately trying to raise the ransom money to save his little brother's life, Alpo's main concern was revenge against the abductors. But Alpo ended up killing Rich over completely separate money issues, not even knowing that Rich needed every dollar he could get for Donald's ransom. With Rich dead, there was nobody left who could pay to get Donald back. Since the boy had seen his captors' faces during weeks of captivity, they couldn't let him go. According to federal testimony, it was Anthony Malik Boatwright, one of Preacher's most twisted enforcers, who finally murdered Donald by snapping his neck with his bare hands. They found his body weeks later, wrapped in garbage bags in the same park where they dumped Rich. This case showed how Preacher's influence could corrupt anybody in his orbit and turn them into monsters willing to destroy their own families for money. Apple's willingness to betray his own nephews revealed the kind of moral bankruptcy that Preacher's presence could inspire in people around him. Now, this story right here is going to blow your mind because it shows just how far Preacher's reach extended beyond the streets. We're talking about April 1993, when Whitney Houston was literally the biggest female entertainer on the planet. The Bodyguard had just made her even more famous than she already was, and she was at the absolute peak of her career. But none of that fame, none of that money, none of that star power could protect her from having to personally deliver $400,000 in cash to save her husband from Preacher's clutches. The whole situation started because Bobby Brown had a serious coke problem and was getting drugs on consignment from dealers who expected to be paid back. Bobby owed $25,000 to some New Jersey dealer, which wasn't even that much money by drug dealer standards, but it became a huge problem when Preacher got wind of it. See, Preacher was at a gambling table when he ran into this frustrated dealer who was complaining about Bobby's unpaid debt. Instead of just helping the man collect his money, Preacher saw an opportunity for a much bigger score. He told the dealer he'd take over the debt, paid him off, and now Bobby owed Preacher instead. But Preacher wasn't planning to collect just $25,000 from a celebrity who could afford way more than that.
They got on the phone and talked to Whitney and told her, you know, serious, don't go calling nobody and all this. You come here and get this.
The abduction went down exactly like all of Preacher's operations. Methodical, brutal, and designed to break people's minds. They lured Bobby out of a Manhattan nightclub with promises of more coke, but instead of going to a party, he got taken to a vacant apartment in the Bronx, where the real nightmare began. Once they had him, Bobby got the full preacher treatment. They stripped him naked, hogtied him, and beat him while explaining in graphic detail what would happen to him and Whitney if she didn't pay up. The crew took turns putting guns to his head and describing exactly how they would murder Whitney if she tried to involve the police or FBI. Now think about this from Whitney's perspective. Here she is, one of the most famous people in the world, and she gets a call from her husband who's been abducted by street criminals demanding $400,000. That's 16 times more than Bobby's original debt. But Preacher understood celebrity psychology perfectly. He knew Whitney could afford it, and more importantly, he knew her fame would actually work against her because she couldn't risk the publicity of involving law enforcement.
She had just made the movie The Bodyguard, and she came to the by herself in a cab with a big pair of glasses and a wig with $400,000 in the bag to come get that.
So Whitney had to figure out how to get $400,000 in cash without attracting attention from banks, her security team, or anybody else who might question why she needed that much money. Then, she had to personally deliver it to dangerous criminals in the Bronx while disguised in a wig and sunglasses, carrying a duffel bag full of more cash than most people see in their lifetime. This wasn't just another crime for Preacher. This was proof that his terror reached into the highest levels of celebrity culture. He had successfully extorted one of the world's biggest stars and forced her to pay an enormous ransom while keeping the whole thing secret from both law enforcement and the media. The wild part is that Whitney's celebrity status actually made her more vulnerable to this type of crime, while she had access to security and resources that regular people could never imagine. Her fame trapped her. She couldn't risk the career damage and personal humiliation that would come from the public finding out about Bobby's drug problems and their family being victimized by street criminals. According to crew members who later snitched to the feds, Preacher kept most of that $400,000 for himself and only gave small amounts to the dudes who actually did the abduction. That's how he maintained control, keeping everybody dependent on his generosity instead of letting them get their own money and potentially become rivals. This Whitney Houston situation proved that Preacher's appetite for victims had no limits whatsoever. From street dealers to global superstars, from Supreme Team enforcers to innocent children, nobody was safe when the Black Hand of Death decided you had something he wanted. By the mid-90s, Preacher's reign of terror had gotten so out of control that the federal government had to create a special task force just to take him down. The C-11 squad combined FBI resources with NYPD street knowledge, and they were specifically designed to go after violent drug crews that local police couldn't handle. But even with all that firepower focused on him, Preacher's downfall came from his own paranoia and his willingness to murder his most loyal soldiers. As the feds closed in, Preacher started seeing enemies everywhere, including among crew members who had been riding with him for years and never gave him any reason to doubt their loyalty. His decision to start killing his own people ended up giving investigators the witnesses they needed to build an ironclad case against his entire organization.
Stone Cold Killer himself, who became an informant, that was so fearful of Preacher and of being killed like his partners had, that he came to me, that he came to us, that he gave us information on specific crimes.
The biggest mistake Preacher made was deciding to kill Anthony Malik Boatwright, the same psycho enforcer who had murdered 12-year-old Donald Porter and done countless other hits for the organization. Despite Malik's complete loyalty and willingness to commit any act of violence Preacher ordered, his military background and weapons knowledge made Preacher paranoid that he could potentially operate independently or challenge his authority. The murder went down in that same basement at 2075 Grand Concourse, where so many other victims had been tortured and killed. John Cuff, Preacher's main lieutenant, who was a corrupt ex-housing cop, lured Malik downstairs under the pretense of testing out a new gun. When Malik bent down to turn up a radio like Cuff asked him to, Cuff shot him multiple times in the back of the head and chest. After they killed Malik, the crew dismembered his body with a circular saw, poured acid on his arms to remove gang tattoos, and scattered the pieces around Queens. But they kept his severed head in a refrigerator for weeks, using it to terrorize other crew members and keep them in line. When the feds finally got search warrants for that building, forensic specialists used blacklight technology to find blood evidence all over those basement walls, despite years of cleaning with acid. The arrest started in August 1996 when federal agents spotted Preacher coming out of his headquarters building. Despite his reputation for violence and having dozens of armed followers, he surrendered without putting up any fight. But what happened next shocked everybody who knew about Preacher's reputation.
For this stone-cold killer that controlled Harlem for decades, almost decades, to just flip at the drop of a hat to save his own, I mean, I found that amazing.
The man who had terrorized New York for over a decade, who had built his entire reputation on never showing weakness, started cooperating with federal authorities within hours of his arrest. Preacher was looking at the death penalty and decided to save his own skin by telling on everybody who had ever trusted him, including his own son and daughter, who were part of the organization. His cooperation was devastating to his former crew members. This dude, who had demanded absolute loyalty from everybody else, was willing to betray everyone when his own life was on the line. Johnny Apple Porter, facing the death penalty for his role in his nephew's murder, also started cooperating and provided detailed testimony about how the abduction had been planned and executed. At his sentencing hearing, Preacher showed no remorse for the decades of terror he had inflicted on New York. His final statement to the court was just more of the same manipulation that had defined his character his whole life.
I read in the papers the government labeled me the Black Hand of Death. They're good at these labels. Be that as it may, and with all due respect, Your Honor, I will leave and surrender the last words to the white hands of justice. God forgive us all.
The judge wasn't having none of that performance and sentenced Preacher to life in prison plus 225 years, ensuring he would never again be free to terrorize anybody. John Cuff and the other key members got similar sentences, and the Preacher crew was finally dismantled after more than a decade of violence. The end of Preacher's reign marked the conclusion of an era when one individual could hold an entire city's criminal underworld hostage through pure terror. For over 10 years, he had proven that real power didn't come from organization or territory. It came from the willingness to go further than anybody else could imagine. Alpo Martinez, despite his killer reputation, had operated under Preacher's shadow. The Supreme Team's top enforcer had been humiliated and crushed when he tried to challenge Preacher's authority. Even Whitney Houston had been forced to pay tribute to the Black Hand of Death. But in the end, the monster who had terrorized everybody else turned out to be nothing but a coward when faced with his own mortality, quickly snitching on everyone who had ever trusted him to save his own life. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.